She thought it was just a small act of kindness, feeding a hungry stray and giving him shelter for one night. But weeks later, the same dog returned, not alone, but with a shocking surprise that left the woman, and her entire neighborhood, speechless. What the dog brought back will melt your heart. It was an ordinary evening. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in shades of gold as Sarah stepped onto her porch with a cup of tea. The street was quiet, the kind of stillness that came just before nightfall. That's when she noticed him. A German shepherd lingered at the edge of her yard, ribs showing beneath his dull coat, eyes fixed on her with a mix of hunger and hope. His paws looked worn, his stance unsteady, as though he had traveled a long way just to end up here. For a moment Sarah hesitated. A stray could be unpredictable, but something about his eyes, tired, pleading, desperate, pulled at her heart. And so, with one small step, she made a choice she never knew would change her life forever. Sarah set her teacup aside and disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a bowl of leftovers and a dish of fresh water. She placed them gently at the edge of the porch and stepped back, giving the dog space. The shepherd hesitated, nose twitching, eyes locked on her as if asking permission. Then, slowly, he crept forward, his legs shaky but determined. He lowered his head and devoured the food, each bite a mix of desperation and relief. When he finished, he lapped at the water, his tail giving the faintest wag. Sarah laid an old blanket on the porch. To her surprise, the dog curled up on it, letting out a deep sigh, as though he finally felt safe. Neighbors shook their heads. "Don't get attached," they warned. But Sarah only smiled softly. It was just one night, or so she thought. The next morning, the blanket on Sarah's porch was empty. The German shepherd was gone. Sarah stepped outside, scanning the street, half expecting to see him curled under a tree or waiting at her gate. But there was nothing, only silence. At first, she told herself it was better this way. Maybe he had wandered off. Maybe he'd found food somewhere else. Yet a part of her heart ached. She thought about his tired eyes, the way he had sighed when he finally lay down to rest. Days passed. Each evening, Sarah caught herself glancing at the porch, listening for the sound of paws on the steps. But he never returned. Neighbors shrugged. "Strays come and go," they said. Sarah nodded, but inside she couldn't forget him. She didn't know why his absence felt heavier than his presence. What she didn't realize was that the dog hadn't forgotten her either. It was nearly 3 weeks later, when Sarah first heard it barking outside her porch. Not frantic, not aggressive, but sharp and deliberate, as if calling her out. She hurried to the door and froze. There he was. The same German shepherd, his coat still rough, but his eyes brighter, filled with something new, determination. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 tiny puppies stumbled awkwardly on their paws, tails wagging, noses pressed to the wooden steps. They looked barely old enough to be away from their mother, their little whimpers mixing with playful growls. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Her heart raced as she realized what had happened. The dog hadn't just come back, he had brought his family. The shepherd nudged the pups forward gently, glancing at Sarah as though he was asking her for help. Once again, her eyes filled with tears. This was no random visit. This was trust. Sarah stepped off the porch slowly, afraid to startle them. The German shepherd stayed still, his body tense, but his eyes, those same pleading eyes, never left hers. With a soft nudge, he pushed the puppies closer to her feet, as if offering them into her care. Sarah knelt, her heart breaking and swelling all at once. The pups sniffed at her shoes, one tumbling over clumsily, the other wagging its tiny tail with unshaken trust. And then the truth hit her. His shepherd had remembered her kindness. He hadn't just returned for food or shelter. He had brought her what mattered most to him, his family. It wasn't abandonment. It was faith. He trusted her with the most precious part of his world. Sarah looked into his weary eyes, tears forming in her own. One small act weeks ago had grown into a bond she never imagined. But now she faced a question. Could she care for them all? Sarah didn't hesitate. She opened her door wide and motioned them inside. At first, the shepherd hesitated, his protective instincts flaring, but when the puppies clumsily padded through the doorway, he followed close behind, never letting them out of sight. Inside, Sarah laid out bowls of food and water. The puppies dove in eagerly, their little tails wagging as crumbs scattered across the floor. She laughed, softly, wiping away a tear while the shepherd stood watch, his eyes softening as his pups ate safely. Later, she spread blankets by the fireplace. The mother dog circled twice before settling down, the pups curling against her belly with satisfied sighs. For the first time, Sarah saw him relax, his head resting on his paws, eyes closing not in fear but in peace. News spread quickly. Neighbors peeked in, stunned by the sight. Some offered food, others toys. What began as one act of kindness had now become something bigger. A home. Weeks passed, and Sarah's house no longer felt the same. It echoed with the sound of tiny paws racing across the floor, playful yips, and the gentle thump of a tail against the furniture. The puppies grew stronger each day, curious, mischievous, full of life. Neighborhood children often stopped by to play with them, filling Sarah's porch with laughter. The German shepherd, once a wary stray, now stood proudly beside her, no longer thin and broken but healthy, alert, and at peace. Sometimes Sarah would sit by the fireplace, the pups curled in her lap, while their father rested at her feet. She would think back to that night she first offered him food, never realizing how far that moment of kindness would reach. She hadn't just saved a hungry dog, she had gained a family. And in return, the dog who once looked at her, with desperate eyes, now gazed at her with something different, trust, devotion, and love. She thought she had rescued him, but the truth was, he had rescued her too.